Hello, everybody. This is Helen Alton, the director at the Haines Sheldon Museum, and I am doing History Tidbits for us. Um, I'm just going to repeat my name in case it didn't record it, but I am Helen Alton from the Haines Sheldon Museum. I'm the director here, and this is the 7th History Tidbit that we have produced since we've all gone into shelter in place, and this one is on cables and communication. As I was researching this topic, I found it interesting that probably this is the most extreme example of continuous federal funding and operation of a piece of infrastructure that was provided to Alaska. The Army and the Air Force provided the only outside telecommunications link for Alaska for 75 years, for the first 3/4 of the 20th century. And basically what they provided was a commercial service because no commercial entity would do it. It was too expensive. So we're talking about communication, and for Alaska, it really starts in 1844 with Samuel Morse, who electrically transmitted the first telegraph message, "What hath God wrought?" from Washington to Baltimore. And this is a picture of the machine and a drawing of him, an artist's rendering of him sending that message. And that started a whole new way for people to communicate. Paper was no longer the main way to get news around, sending letters. Now there was a more instantaneous method, the telegraph. In 1854, the first submarine telegraph cables began between continents, and in fact, 1853 was the very first one, and we have a piece of it in the collection, and I'll be showing that. And this is a map of the Eastern Telegraph Company network in 1901. The dotted lines show potential lines that they're going to be putting in 1902 and 1903, which they did then put down. Laid. And I blew up a portion of that map to show Alaska. So in 1900, this is 1901, this map, and you see there's nothing, no commercial enterprise has put cable or laid any lines in Alaska. So in 1900, Congress appropriated nearly $500,000 to establish a land and then an underwater communication system connecting the various military posts in Alaska with the rest of the United States. Now, the U.S. had laid its first undersea cable in 1899 in the Philippines. The undersea cable industry was really controlled by Britain, and they were doing most of the work up until the 1900s. In a little less than 1 year after the congressional action to open Alaska to telegraphic communications, they were able to send a message from Fort Egbert to Skagway, Alaska, via Dawson, Yukon Territory. And when the message got to Skagway, it was transferred to a steamer bound for Seattle. And then when it got to Seattle, it was tapped into the National Telegraph System. So this allowed a dispatch to go from Fort Egbert to reach Washington, D.C. in 4 days instead of a month. It cut nearly a month off of the transit time. And this is important if you're thinking of there's a series of army outposts in this wilderness territory that America had acquired, and it was taking a month for any news to get to Washington, and then a month for the orders from Washington to get to the territory. So it was 2 months for communication to cycle through prior to creating a telegraph system. So between 1900 and 1905, Army soldiers of the 59th Signal Battalion, who were known as the Voice of the Arctic, constructed a telegraph line linking the U.S. Army posts across Alaska with each other. And this is some of the gear. This is Lieutenant William Billy Mitchell from 1902, and this is from the U.S. Air Force Communications Agency Office of History. But it shows you some of the gear that they had to wear, some of the conditions they were going through. I mean, this was still wilderness that they were trying to construct a network through. Here in Haines, the fort in 1903 began construction, and the very first thing they built was the signal office. And I've circled it. It's a little building that is now a gift shop, still exists, and it was the most significant building for the fort. It was the first one built, and it was the last one manned when the fort was decommissioned in 1945. So underwater cables had to be put in to really connect up. What was happening with that first year in 1901, when the first message got through, is that it had to go through Canada. Canada had telegraph lines, and then Canada taking it through Canada and then bringing it back down to Skagway, which was closest to Whitehorse. In order for things to get through, it was all based on Canada being nice. So Canada actually charged more for the telegraph line use than the US did. And so it was a little more expensive to take a message through Canada and then back into the US. It was also, we were beholden to a foreign country, and this wasn't something that people felt real comfortable with, especially if it's military communications that are being transferred through. So they needed to put in some underwater cables, and the first cables was Fort St. Michael, which was where that was the military head, and so that became the first cable, and then Fort St. Michael to Safety Harbor. The second cable was between Skagway and Juneau, and that second cable is the one that it added in Haines. It was 123 miles. It opened August 23rd of 1901, and it stopped working after a few days. It took them until June 9th, 1902 to get it in good working order. They ran into weather starting to become more problematic. As we know, from August on, things get pretty nasty in our area, and they couldn't get to the cable to fix it well. So it took them until June to do it. Aside from the military value of the cable, it very quickly became apparent that it had a commercial importance to southeastern Alaska. And that commercial importance showed itself in the 21 days that that cable between Skagway and Juneau actually operated. It made over $500, which was quite a bit of money at the turn of the 20th century. In 1903, then, because of this need to link further beyond Alaska, so we were able to communicate within Alaska pretty well, and we were able to get a steamer to take something down to Seattle, but we really wanted to kind of have it faster communication. So in 1903, an underwater cable between Sitka, Alaska, and Seattle, Washington was laid, and this allowed a rapid communication between Alaska and the lower continental US. So how were these cables put in? Well, this is the C.S. Burnside. And the C.S. Burnside was a cable ship built in 1882 by Campbell, McIntosh, and Bosted from Newcastle upon Tyne. It was 285.2 feet long with a gross tonnage of 2,226. It was built to go to Australia. It was a cargo freighter between England and Australia. And then it ended up in the hands of some Spanish owners. It went through a few owners, and it was captured by the U.S. cruiser Yale during the Spanish-American War and renamed Burnside. It was a cargo ship, but then they converted it to a cable ship when the C.S. Hooker was lost in the Philippines while it was laying cables in 1899. So the C.S. Burnside completed that work in the Philippines through 1900. And then in 1903, the C.S. Burnside was brought to work on the U.S.-Alaska cable. And it laid first the section from Sitka to Juneau. And then in the following year, and that was 291 nanometers. And then the following year, they laid 1,070 nanometers of cable from Sitka to Seattle. And then they did a further 640 nanometers from Sitka to Valdez. So these were the cables that the U.S. Army Signal Corps operated for the Washington, Alaska Military Cable and Telegraph System, which is known as WOMCATS. So this is the map of WOMCATS. This is a map from of what WOMCATS had in 1925. So 1925, Womcats had all of these lines coming up into Alaska, and I've blown up the area that is Haines. And so if you look here, it says Fort William H. Seward, and then in parentheses, Haines. So we are one of the stops here. And then Whitehorse is a stop, and Atlin is a stop. But you've got Fort William H. Seward is one of the stops, and this is Juneau down here. So this is 1904 Womcats, which I think is a great name. And this is a map, an original map from the Alaska Signal Corps in 1904, and it shows in red the completion of the cable system and all of the different stops, all the different offices. And again, here we are. So the cable system went to Sitka, and then it came back around and up into Lynn Canal, and then Skagway and us are two stops. And then it shows the Canadian side of things here going down into Canada. Okay. I wanted to just tell a little story about the start of the 1901 laying of the cable. And this is the first group coming in to lay the cable was Technical Sergeant Charles Murphy and his 22-man construction crew. And they were assigned to begin the construction of the telegraph line from Valdez. They arrived in Valdez aboard the SS Excelsior on the 4th of July, 1900. As there was no dock, the ship had to anchor some distance from the shore and have its load of passengers and cargo ferried to the shore. One adventurous young man was too anxious to wait. Wishing to get to shore as soon as possible, he had himself and his 3 horses lowered into the water to swim to shore. He tied a rope to his wrist and secured it on the halter of one of the horses in order to ease his swim to shore. His plan worked fine until the horse reached the water's end and began running at a gallop up and down the beach, dragging its screaming owner. Murphy's men cornered the horse and cut the young man loose before he suffered any serious injury. The impatient young man was Jack London, who had come to Alaska to find the story that would become the Call of the Wild and would entrench the intrigue of Alaska into the minds of generations to come. So the cable brought one of our most famous writers to Alaska. By 1921, this cable was worn out. It required numerous repairs, which caused frequent interruptions to the large volume of traffic that was passing over it. And it needed a new modern system. So the Signal Corps secured and converted the steamship Delwood into a cable ship after getting funding from Congress, and it had the latest improvements for laying cable. And then in 1923 and 1925, Congress appropriated $750,000 for a total of $1.5 million to replace the worn-out Alaskan cable. And basically, what was happening in 1925, a report that was made to the government about the whole the history of the Alaska cables, the system, the Womcats and the Alaska cable system. Traffic pertaining to commerce was for a long time held first place on the Alaskan cable, although it had originally been laid for military purposes. So by the time this happened, our cable in Haines was only about 30% military, and it was 60% or more private people communicating for various reasons. So this is the cable ship Delwood that was retrofitted, and this is in 1924. And here you can see the cable line coming off of it and being pulled ashore. And in the 1925 report, it stated that the successful transportation and laying of this new cable in such a short space of time by the cable ship Delwood, without hitch or flaw and in full keeping with predetermined engineering schedules, demonstrated that the United States now had in its possession and operation a cable ship capable of transporting 1,800 miles of deep-sea cable and carrying on cable laying operations in any ocean. The Delwood was laying a cable that was created by the English. So in 1923, they opened bids for the cable and found that only 5 cable manufacturers had submitted bids. 4 of them were British and none of them were American. And they had actually changed the specs on the cable. The cables were always done with gutta percha, which was a material that really resisted getting water into the cable. And it was something that the British had sources for, and the British had kind of created how to make. And the Americans couldn't. So the Americans were working with rubber and trying to figure out ways to cover cables using the materials that they had. And so when they put out the bid for this cable, they allowed it to be made of something other than gutta percha. Well, the result was that they ended up with a British manufacturer, and they used a gutta percha cable in the end because they didn't have an American manufacturer who bid on it. The ship, the Delwood, had to go to London to get the cable. They manufactured the cable specifically for this purpose, and they had to go to London, get the cable, come back from London. They took 3 months to go to London and then come back. And then they would lay the cable. And then when they ran out, they had to go back to London for the next batch and come back. So it was a pretty lengthy project and involved quite a lot of sea time for the Delwood. The transatlantic cables from in the 19th century, from the mid-1800s, consisted of an outer layer of iron and later steel wire. And this one has a little copper wrap around it that kind of holds the whole thing together. But this is the outer layer of steel wire, and it wrapped India rubber, which is in here, and then gutta percha, and then multi-strands of copper. And the copper core is what the sound went through. And the portions near each shore landing had additional protective armor. The gutta percha is a natural polymer similar to rubber, and it had nearly ideal properties for insulating submarine cables. Now, when they first laid the cables throughout the world, as they were doing this whole cable laying, they discovered some interesting things. And one of the things they discovered is that there was a series of worm that really liked to bore into the cable and eat the insides. So that was an issue, and they had to deal with that. Then they also found that sea life would interact with the cable. So in one instance, the cable went out, and when they went and pulled the cable, investigating it, they found a whale wrapped up in it. And the whale had been using the cable to scrape barnacles. The cable had kind of gone down a cliff in the sea and was scraping barnacles off of himself with the cable, and then he got wrapped up in it, and it drowned him. Another instance, they would find breaks that they couldn't quite figure out, and they finally pieced it together that it was sawfish, the saw nose sort of sawed the line. There were also numerous incidents of sharks biting the line. So these lines, putting something in the ocean, you're not just dealing with salt and corrosion and water, but you're also dealing with the wildlife that's in the ocean. Here in 1925 is the Womcats stations, and you can see all of the stations here, interior and then the exterior. And it's basically one line down from Seattle coming up to Ketchikan, and then Sitka gets interlinked here, and this one goes up to Valdez. This is the interior of the Signal Corps office in Haines. It shows the desk, chair, radio, and typewriter, 1930. And the Alaska cable system was available for commercial as well as governmental use. And it handled day messages, night messages, which actually and night letters, which they kind of invented as a method of communication, and press matter, so stuff for the press, on the same basis as telegraph companies throughout the United States. So it's basically a commercial venture that is being run by the U.S. Army. At the more important offices, a telegraphic money transfer service operated, and messages were sent and received by cable, telegraph, or radio. Now, this is an image of Steve Stoddard, who was a U.S. Army Signal Corps private. He was in the summer of 45, as they were divesting of the the fort, the last group that stayed was the U.S. Army Signal Corps. So it was the only army left in the summer of 45. He has his arm around Charmaine Weenie Rainey, and in the background is the little telegraph relay station right back there. He was originally from Utah, from Altoona, Utah. He was born on November 17th, 1917, and he was stationed in Haines from 1944 to 1945. And he was a signalman, ham radio, and telegraph operator. After leaving Haines, he lived in Delta, Utah, and became a beekeeper. And we have 2 pictures of him in our collection. Now, we looked at what it looked like back then. This is what it looks like today. This is the submarine cables today. It is how we get everything, all of our communication. And this is the submarine cable coming up into our area. You can see there's 4 main lines that come into Alaska, and then there's a couple of lines that scoot off into our part of Alaska. This is a piece of cable that was put in between Skagway and Haines, and you can see how different it is from the older cable. We've showing here there's 3 bundles of copper wires, and then there's some aluminum sheathing here that you can see as a little thin part there. It still has the iron exterior and another coating here to help keep things from getting into it. It also has this little fiber optic wire. Now we've kind of gone all fiber optic now rather than the metal core. So this is the modern submarine communication cable. It's polyethylene is the first layer, the outer layer, mylar tape, steel wires, an aluminum water barrier, polycarbonate, copper or aluminum tube, petroleum jelly, and then now we're using optical fibers, glass fibers. The point of all this is that you've got a wire that you're trying to send sound through or send electrical impulses through. And what they found is that the longer the wire, the more disturbance you get. You are getting kind of a physical breakdown of the signal. And we've found that glass actually allows things to go through without having as much disturbance of the signal. This is a typical submarine cable system being laid. There's a landing station, it gets laid down, there's some armoring that happens, and these days they're trying to bury it. And as most of us know, in Haines, a few years ago, there was an earthquake, and we lost all of our communication capabilities. Our internet, our phone, everything went out because the cable was broken between us and Juneau. So we were very reliant on it. None of our friends and family down south knew that we'd had an earthquake because no news could get out. And this is a little bit of a blow up of that map showing the different names of the lines. This is the Alaska United East, North Star, Alaska United West, ACS Alaska Oregon, and this is the Southeast Alaska one coming through here. And this is our area. A little stylized, but you can see we've got a couple of lines coming into our area in Haines. So I would like to thank you for listening. We have a project on our website, sheldonmuseum.org, under special events. And it is something that the kids can do with paper cups or tin cans or plastic cups and some string. And they should try using different kinds of string to make what we used to call a telephone. When I was a kid, my siblings, there were quite a number of us, and we all had our own cup and string, and then there was one person who manned a switchboard, and the switchboard was made of a piece of wood with nails in it, and you wrapped the end of a string around the nail, and then whoever wanted to talk to that person, that string got wrapped around, and you could, by keeping the strings taut, you could talk to people in different rooms, and the switchboard operator would just switch off who talked to whom in different rooms. I was looking to see if anybody had that online, and nobody did. So I would suggest those of you who are home with children, if you can get an area of your house where you don't mind having lots and lots of string going everywhere, that you try that. We also have some terms: transatlantic cable, gutta percha, WOMCATs, and ACS for the Alaska cable system. And I would like to give special thanks to the Alaska Power and Telephone Company, who donated a sample of the cable that was laid between Haines and Skagway. Thank you for joining me. As you know, I've been working in a home office, and you've been hearing things like my email beeping and the phone ringing. So thank you very much for being patient with all of that.